So this is our third day on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And today is sort of a review day for us because we're going to be looking at what's called the fourth paralogism, or the A version of the Refutation of Idealism, which doesn't present a lot of new material, but just tries to summarize what we've seen so far and what's meant by Kant's claim that space and time and the objects of the material world are empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. This is called his Transcendental Idealism and his Empirical Realism, which are the descriptors that we use for Kant's philosophy. So remember, let's review just a little bit. The question Kant is asking is, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? How are the truths of science and mathematics possible? Remember, a synthetic a priori proposition is a truth about the world that you can know a priori, or know before you look. And Kant's answer was not to try to figure out how we can know the external world, but instead to take the opposite approach, to do his Copernican revolution and say, if we assume that we do have synthetic a priori knowledge in mathematics and science, what must be the transcendental conditions? What must be happening to explain how we can know something about the world before we look? How can we know about what's going to be in that room before we open up the door and look? The only way we could know is if there were a bouncer on the room, a filter on possible experience. And it's important to see that for Kant, those transcendental conditions define a definition of reality. We define what a real experience is, an objective experience, by what is in accordance with the universal rules of experience that we all impose upon our experience, that allows us to determine what's real and objective and what's merely a hallucination or a dream. So if I were to dream something, that I had traveled to China, and I wake up, I can tell that that isn't real, because I can't fit it into my objective time series. If we had a video watching me, it would have a timestamp on each minute, and I could watch what I was doing while I was sleeping in each of those minutes of time, in each of those places in space. And my dreams or my hallucinations wouldn't fit into that objective space-time grid. And we all possess the same space-time grid, the same laws of nature. So we can all sort of correlate our different experiences and say, this happened here, this was happening in this room. In a court of law, we can talk about whether X happened in this room at this particular time, or we can ask about an alibi, where this person was in space at this particular time, and we can all agree on it. Delusions or dreams don't fit into that objective space and time. Or if we see something, as in Hume's examples of miracles, that don't follow the laws of nature, we'll see that means that it won't get past the bouncer. We won't call that a real experience. We'll call that a psychotic episode or a hallucination. So the answer that he gives to how we can have synthetic a priori knowledge are that there has to be transcendental conditions. There have to be filters on experience. And those filters on experience are going to determine, like the bouncer does, what's real, what gets into our experience, what we call real, and what we say is not real. So remember that the domain of reality is this domain of phenomena. To call something real, according to Kant, is to say it passes the filter of sensibility, the transcendental aesthetic, and the filter of understanding, the transcendental logic, which we haven't yet talked about. But the transcendental conditions determine which of our experiences are real and which of them are hallucinations. They don't tell us about what's outside of our experience. They don't tell us about noumena, about things in themselves. This confusion between noumena and phenomena is going to be the source of the difference between transcendental realism and transcendental idealism and empirical realism, and is going to be the source of what's called the paralogism. So in today's reading, we're taking a little jump to this second big section of the Critique of Pure Reason, called the Transcendental Dialectic. All of the real work of spelling out the transcendental conditions happens in these first sections. The Transcendental Dialectic is just pointing out how not paying attention to the Critique of Pure Reason leads to certain errors. You may remember that dialectic meant a movement back and forth between different contradictory positions. So the Transcendental Dialectic is about different types of contradictions in reason, different types of mistakes that can occur when you attempt to apply concepts beyond experience, when you attempt to talk about noumena, or things in themselves. And much of the Critique of Pure Reason, the majority of the book, deals with the ways in which the classical problems of philosophy result from contradictions that arise from going beyond the limits of experience. Later, we'll look at another selection from the Transcendental Dialectic that shows that in metaphysics you can prove both sides of any question because attempting to go beyond the limits of experience leads you to these contradictions. We're looking at a particular type of mistaken reasoning that's called a paralogism. Paralogism is just a word that means fallacy or mistaken reasoning. And a paralogism is the mistaken reasoning that's called ambiguity or equivocation, where you change the meaning of a term in the middle of an argument. And as you can imagine, Kant is going to suggest that the mistakes of David Hume and George Berkeley were due to paralogisms, or changes in the meaning of terms from thinking about reality as an object of experience and thinking about reality as a noumena, as a thing in itself beyond our experience. So there are sort of two definitions of reality, and the classical modern philosophers like Hume and Berkeley and Descartes, Kant thinks, made the mistake, the logical error, of confusing reality as an experience in accordance with transcendental conditions, that's what he calls empirically real, with reality as a thing in itself outside of our experience. That would be transcendentally real. So the passage that we're reading is a passage that only existed in the A version, or the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. We're going to read the second edition version of this later, and it's called the Refutation of Idealism. So what's happening in this section called the Paralogism is an attempt to refute what he calls the idealism of George Berkeley and the skeptical idealism of David Hume. And he thinks that they arise from this paralogism, this equivocation, this change in meaning on what we mean by real and outside of us. So he's going to be suggesting that what we mean by real and outside of us is the empirical meaning. What we call an external object is an object that's outside of me in space and time. So right now I can look at this computer screen, or you can look at your hand in front of your face, and I can say that's a real thing outside of me. I don't mean that it's outside of my experience. I mean it's outside of my head. You can locate your head in space, and it's in one place, and then your hand is outside of your head in space outside of you. That's a clear-cut, common-sense meaning of outside of us. That's the empirical meaning of outside of us. So this phrase outside of us, Kant says, is ambiguous. It can mean this very clear sense, this common sense, empirical meaning of outside of your body in space and time, but it can also mean outside of experience completely, as a thing itself. So that is the transcendental meaning of real, or outside of us, as a thing outside of us, as a noumena. Whereas the empirical meaning of outside of us just means outer appearances. In our experience, it exists outside of our body. So things that are found in space are empirically real, just as space and time we saw were empirically real because they were objective universal conditions on anything that will count as a reality and not a dream or a delusion. So the empirical definition of reality is whatever is in a perception that's connected in accordance with these transcendental conditions. If it's in our objective space and time, and it's in accordance with the laws of physics, which we'll see are the transcendental conditions of the understanding, then that's when we'll call it actual. That's when it's not a delusion or a psychotic episode or a dream. But the dogmatic or the skeptical idealist, the dogmatic idealist would be George Berkeley, who thought that there was some contradiction in the very idea of matter or substance, as we saw in his canonical argument. Or someone like David Hume, who thought that we just couldn't tell whether the objects that we perceived were real. They all arose from a particular paralogism or equivocation. They were taking real as a transcendental term, referring to its reality outside of experience, whereas Kant says that what we really mean by real is just an experience that exists outside of our head in space and time in accordance with these universal transcendental conditions that get past our bouncers. So the scandal of idealism that Kant's trying to refute is what happens, Kant thinks, when you make this equivocation. You take the very reasonable position that we don't know anything outside of our own mind. We don't know anything outside of our experience. And we make it seem like empirical idealism. We make it so transcendental idealism Kant agrees with, but empirical idealism would be the view that everything is just a dream, everything is just an idea in your head, everything is just an illusion, everything is just a dream. And Kant says that's completely mistaken. We can tell that certain things are verifiable and objective scientifically and mathematical, and that we all perceive them the same way. That means empirically real. Empirically ideal would be an illusion, a dream, a psychotic episode, a hallucination that couldn't fit into our objective space and time and that violated our universally accepted laws of nature. So if you take real to mean objects in themselves, if you take outside of you to mean things in themselves, Kant says that Hume is completely right, that and Descartes was right, that it's impossible to arrive at knowledge of that reality outside of us, since we have to merely rely on the representation which is inside of us. So instead, Kant says his transcendental idealism is that we should never push our description of reality outside of the limits of possible experience. We should always use our concepts and apply space and time in the empirical sense. If we're consistent and only talk about real as the Copernican revolution does, as in accordance with universally accepted subjective laws and transcendental conditions of experience. If we mean by real only what gets through our bouncer and what every human being will always perceive to be the same, then we'll never run into the metaphysical extravagances of Berkeley or of David Hume. So here's our summary of what transcendental idealism and empirical realism is. So Kant is a transcendental idealist, but he's also an empirical realist. And he thinks that these are both positions about the objects of experience, the objects that exist outside of us in space and time. He's not going to fall into that ambiguity and imagine that objects are things in themselves or noumena. He wants to ask, are the things of our experience, is my hand, is this cup of tea, is this pencil, are they real or ideal? So real means they are real, and ideal means no, they're not. But we can ask that question in either of two ways. Is it really outside of your experience? So Kant says no, that chair, that table, space and time are not transcendentally real. They're not outside of your experience. They're not a noumena. So Kant is a transcendental idealist. If you're going to ask the question in the transcendental way, is it a noumena? Is it outside of my experience? Is the thing that I'm looking at now something I'm not looking at? Then, of course, it's not real in that sense. Space and time only exist inside our mind. The objects that we perceive only exist in our experience. They don't exist outside of our experience. If we use outside to mean outside of experience, but if we use the empirical definition of outside of, which just means outside of my head in space and time, not a hallucination, not a dream, not a psychotic episode, in accordance with the way that everybody universally constructs their experience, then, of course, my hand and my cup of tea and those things are empirically real. So Kant is an empirical realist, but a transcendental idealist. So let's look at some examples. These are the types of questions I might ask you on an exam. I might give you examples of different types of things, like space and time, or a tree, or a table, or God, or a dream, and ask you, are they empirically real or transcendentally ideal? So transcendentally ideal things would be things that don't exist as objects outside our experience. They're not noumena. Transcendental, remember, talks about outside of us as outside of experience. So space and time, objects like trees and tables are transcendentally ideal. They don't exist outside of experience. What would be transcendentally real? Well, the whole critique of pure reason is to say none of our concepts apply transcendentally. None of the things like tables or chairs or numbers or space or science, none of that applies transcendentally. Most of the errors of metaphysics and philosophy come from trying to apply our concepts and ideas transcendentally. But remember, we mentioned this before in talking about the transcendental aesthetic, that a strange consequence of Kant's transcendental method is that we kind of do know that something exists outside of our experience, because we're looking at what our experience is like and saying what must be the case in order to have synthetic a priori propositions. In order to have synthetic a priori propositions, there must be a bouncer, there must be a transcendental condition, there must be a filter. So we do indeed know that transcendental conditions, some type of filter, and of course that's going to turn out to be some part of myself, my transcendental ego. There is somebody who's doing the construction of experience. If I know all that chart we looked at that showed the sensibility and the imagination and the understanding, those are all transcendental objects. I don't perceive those through experience. I infer them through these transcendental arguments. In the second critique, Kant will also think that we can come to a similar transcendental knowledge of God as something that exists outside of us. So God and the self, a noumenal self or transcendental ego, are some things that Kant thinks are transcendentally real, but nothing else, really. No of the objects we normally talk about in ordinary life are transcendentally real. They're all empirically real. That means they exist outside of our mind in space and time. They exist outside of our head and outside of our bodies in space and time. They're real and objective. Everybody else would see them. If we said, come to this space and look at this time, everybody would see the same thing, just like witnesses in a court of law. So real empirically means real in that sense. So space and time, the laws of nature, trees and tables, and any real object would be empirically real in this sense. Not transcendentally real. They wouldn't exist outside of your experience as a noumena, but they would be real experiences, real phenomena. What would be empirically ideal then? Well, the only things that would be empirically ideal would be hallucinations and dreams, psychotic episodes, things that when we went to that space and time, not all of us would see them. Only some person who had this unique subjective experience. Empirically real is universal objective experience, which means in accordance with the bouncer so that everyone would perceive it the same way. So Kant's refutation of idealism is to say that Hume's skeptical idealism and Berkeley's dogmatic idealism tried to take real as transcendental sense, in its transcendental meaning, as outside of our experience. And if that's the case, then Kant thinks they were right. That objects that we experience and all of our concepts are merely applied to our experience. They're transcendentally ideal. They don't exist outside of our mind. But Kant thinks their mistake was equivocating and assuming that that meant that they were also just like hallucinations or dreams, that they were also empirically ideal. Kant thinks that once you make the Copernican revolution, you can see that things inside of our mind, things that our mind constructs, can be real if they're experienced by everyone in exactly the same way, because there are these bouncers or transcendental conditions that guarantee that there is a real objective experience that we all see the same way, that will distinguish it from the empirically ideal hallucinations and dreams. So once more, Kant is a transcendental idealist. None of the things that we talk about are real outside of our experience, but he's an empirical realist. They are real objective features of our experience, and they exist outside of us in space and time.